Good morning, everyone, and thanks for including me, Ansi. I'm always excited to talk to the scientific community. It means I can be a little bit less, I can be a bit more technical, which is always fun. And yeah, thanks for including me, and good morning, everyone. So I'm going to sort of give a quick overview of just transitions and a little bit on renewable energy. And the sort of basic logic of my presentation is as follows. When we think about justice, we assume today's world is just, but it isn't. Today's world is fundamentally unjust, and in particular in South Africa. If we don't respond to climate change, this injustice will get worse. But uncertainty about the way forward kind of causes us as a sort of society-wide to resist change. So yeah, we tend to resist the change, but the evidence supports the need to rapidly change. And the world is shifting, and we risk being left behind if we don't change along with it. We do, however, need to acknowledge that the transition will be extremely challenging, it's extremely difficult, and it will require a huge collaborative effort. And the science, engineering, technology fields are so critical to this debate, both in pushing it forward, but also providing some of the solutions that we might need. It's kind of the basic thesis. The subtext to it is, why in this most crucial of debates do we contest the science and the research? And secondly, how do we leverage the science, engineering, and technology communities both to anchor the debate and to drive innovation? So just a quick intro to the PCC itself. For those of you that don't know us, the Presidential Climate Commission was appointed by the president. There were about 25 commissioners from a range of social partners, business, government, labor, civil society, the youth and faith movements. And the commissioners make recommendations to the president and to cabinet around the just transition, and these recommendations range from technical issues around energy to broader economic policy recommendations. I work for the Secretariat of the Presidential Climate Commission, so I'm not a commissioner. I take direction from the commissioners and coordinate research and stakeholder engagement to help build consensus around recommendations. And the unit is headed by, or the commission, the Secretariat is headed by Dr. Crispin Olver, who many of you know, and yeah, so that's kind of the background to us. We are anchored in this idea of a just transition. This is our driving agenda. So we need to try to understand how within climate constraints do we ensure that our economy is more competitive, but also that creates opportunities for all people, with the context of the triple challenge of poverty, inequality, and unemployment being the sort of primary driver. So when we think about these energy transitions and justice transitions in general, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's conflicting information, there's lots of misinformation and disinformation out there. So it's very difficult to see the pathway forward. And so we tend to anchor on what we know and we resist change. And my presentation is trying to suggest that this is the wrong way of thinking. How do we flip this around? And to this point that the world is not just today. I mean, if we think about South Africa, 55% of people live in poverty, 0.63 Gini coefficient. So this is a measure of economic inequality. And we have the highest Gini coefficient in the world, meaning we're the most unequal society in the world. And we have greater than 30% unemployment more generally. The really scary number is youth unemployment, which in some parts of the country can be as much as 60%. And so again, the economic outcomes of our current strategy are unjust. And then there's some other layers on that. Wealth has a distinctly unequal spatial, racial, and gendered distributional pattern. And so, wealth accrues to people who have wealth, which, because of our historical background, tend to be white men. The current polluting development patterns have also distinct impacts on climate, on nature, and on particular human health. And it is documented that the poor bear the greatest impact of some of these environmental impacts, and in particular climate change, and also have the fewest resources to recover. So as the wealthy are able to insure themselves or able to recover from these big shocks, if you don't have those resources, a big event just knocks you back into poverty. So that's the general idea. Two quotes that I find inspiring. We don't fear the future, we shape it. And in order to shape it, we need to do this together as one group from President Obama. And then the future belongs to those who prepare for it today. And so again, the emphasis is how do we shift this mindset from, it's too difficult, we can't do it, to how are we going to innovate our way out of it. Thinking specifically about electricity transitions, electricity is critical both for economic development, but also for justice. There's some very interesting research from Perry looking at how electricity impacts households. The one stat I enjoy is a household that has access to a reasonable amount of electricity is more likely to start a business and start being entrepreneurial. But it's clear that from an economic perspective, there's a strong correlation between energy availability and economic development and justice of outcomes. But when we think about electricity planning, we have to think about this thing called the electricity trilemma, which was coined by the World Energy Council. And we need to think about energy systems in three axes: environmental sustainability, equity, which is about affordability and access, and security. How can we withstand shocks? Do we have a constant supply? And I think we can accept that the current energy system that we have in South Africa is not really providing any of those things. And so we need some kind of transition, and studies show that a renewable energy-based system is definitely more environmentally sustainable. It definitely provides more equity. It's cheaper. It's easier to roll out in microgrids. Energy security is where the big debate is in South Africa at the moment. How secure can we make these electricity systems? And I have some slides on that. But just to show that the World Energy Council's Energy Trilemma Report Global Rankings came out in the last couple of weeks, and South Africa is ranked 69th in the world, and we've dropped from 64th in the 2022 rankings. And so we're also getting worse in our current situation. Something needs to be done. Last year in April, the PCC released its recommendations on electricity planning. And I think it's important just to pause on process here. How we came to those recommendations is we reviewed all of the existing studies on electricity systems in South Africa. So work done by UCT, by the CSIR, by the National Business Initiative. And all of those studies showed more or less the same thing, that the least cost pathway is variable renewable energy with peaking support and storage. So the peaking support is there to take care of some of these variability issues. And we also then shared these recommendations with our social partners. We had about a year-long stakeholder engagement program where we sat and listened to stakeholders and their perspectives. And we concluded these kind of broad recommendations based on this meta-analysis of what had been done. I should also note that since then, there has been a study by Bloomberg and further studies by the CSR, Stellenbosch University, and UCT that kind of reinforce these findings, that the cheapest way forward and adequately secure and providing social benefits is variable renewable energy plus peaking support plus storage. And so our recommendations were roughly invest in this least cost pathway, resolve the current energy crisis as quickly as we can. That should take sort of paramount focus, and then seek opportunities to accelerate the transition. We were one of the first to highlight the need to focus on the grid. So the grid has clearly now moved much more central to electricity planning. And this needs to be focused on transmission and distribution. We still worry about the focus on distribution being too small. So we've realized that the transmission infrastructure is a major bottleneck in the rolling out of these technologies, but distribution and the business models of municipalities is something that is still, I think, probably not well understood enough. So we need to undertake some major work on pricing reform and market reform in the context of how this impacts local government business models. And then, of course, true to our mandate, we made some recommendations around the just transition. And there are a couple of things that we think need focus. Obviously, the creation of jobs, but in the context of green industrial development. So we need to be thinking about how do we transition economies. And the example that I always use is unemployment in Mpumalanga is around 40%. So even if we create a one-to-one job swap for people who lose their jobs because of the coal transition and gain jobs in the renewable energy sector, you still have unemployment of 40%, and that's not just. And so we need to do more than that. We need to be more than focused on just the energy transition. We need to be thinking about the transition of the economy as a whole, and economic diversification and green industrial development off the back of those energy transitions is something that needs more focus. We need to invest in human resources and skills development, and the CSR covered that incredibly in the first presentation. And then lastly, obviously, we need support for those most impacted by load shedding, particularly SMEs and indigent households. And we need to sort of enhance social protection measures for those that are impacted by the coal transition. So again, it's a very holistic approach. We know that renewable energy is the way forward, but it's complicated. It's not an easy thing to do, and you have to manage sort of a huge Venn diagram of competing interests. I wanted to make the point about renewable energy and the grid and energy security. So the major sort of objection we hear to high penetrations of renewable energy is the impact that it has on the grid and energy stability. And this is a slide that I've unashamedly cut and pasted from an IEA presentation, which basically shows that you have these phases of renewable energy penetration, where in the first phase you have no noticeable impact on the system. In the second phase, you start to see moderate impacts, minor to moderate impacts on the system. In the third phase, you have to think very carefully about how you design your system and your system operations. In phase 4, where you have variable renewable energy meeting some or all of your demand for a short period. We see that happening all over the world now: United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, California, Texas, all at this kind of phase. And then in phase 5, where there are a couple of countries, VRE is providing for a surplus, and that creates this kind of pricing challenges. So we have a very clear sense of how these things are happening globally, and that there are many countries who are far ahead of our level of penetration, and in the process of solving these kinds of problems that arise. I was at a talk the other day, and an expert was basically saying you don't see major challenges to grid stability until VRE penetration is around 50%. All of those other problems have been solved in some or other manner around the world. And so we have a lot of headroom in South Africa to be investing in renewables before we start to hit some of those major challenges. And even when we do, those challenges are solvable. But we need to be aware that these problems exist. So it's not a case of just putting renewables on the grid. There's a whole bunch of parallel problems and technological and market solutions that have to be implemented in parallel. So I want to take a slight deviation from the sort of future of energy markets, just to think about physical climate risk. And this is something that is critical for us to think through, because it provides the counterpoint to our analysis. So we often make the observation that, oh, it's very risky to transition, or it's too difficult, or it's too costly, forgetting that if you don't transition, you are moving into a world with higher average global temperatures. And the impacts of that are important to bear in mind. They're the kind of, if we don't transition now, these are the kinds of problems that we face. And when you look at the science and you look at the degree of the impacts, these are things that you want to avoid. And I'll give you some examples. So South Africa, thinking also about justice, is unequally impacted. So if we warm at twice the rate of the global average. So you can see in these charts for various, or these maps for various temperature increases, we're always in the slightly darker bit, particularly in the Western Cape, because we warm faster than the rest of the world. When we talk about an average, it's obviously not uniform over the whole planet. So it's important to remember that. So if the world warms 2 degrees, we warm 4 degrees. And currently, if you add up all the country commitments around decarbonization, we're heading for a world somewhere between 2 to 2.9 degrees. And so our warming will be somewhere between 4 and 6 degrees. And that's very important for things like agriculture and water supply. So Francois Engelbrecht at the WITS Global Change Institute, one of South Africa and one of the world's best climate modelers, is worried about what he calls tipping points. And if we start to breach these upper thresholds of temperature, we increase the risk of things like a day zero in Johannesburg. or the collapse of the maize crop in sub-Saharan Africa, or large-scale die-off of cattle crops in sub-Saharan Africa. So one example, the drought in Botswana in 2019 resulted in the 40,000 head of cattle dying. So these economic impacts of those kinds of shocks to the system are huge, and we need to be particularly worried about them. The UNFCCC have a group called the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who do a review of all of the available climate science every couple of years. These reports are called assessment reports, and we're currently on the 6th assessment report, which was released beginning of last year. And for the first time, we had a chapter specifically focused on Africa. And the impacts in this chapter are fascinating. A 34% reduction in agricultural output due to climate change, more than any other region. Reduced income and growth and increased income inequality, again, greater than any Africa having worse impacts than anywhere else. Over 3.6 million weather-related displacements. These are people displaced from their home, what people colloquially call climate migrants, that are then wandering around looking for economic opportunity. And a negative 5% impact on GDP per capita for South Africa. Now, what's horrifying about these particular impacts is these are impacts that have already happened. If we look at the impacts that are forecast to happen, a further 25 to 75% reduction in agricultural output, depending on the crop and the scenario, a 50% drop in South Africa's GDP by 2100. Hold that number in your head for later in my presentation. And then with 1.7 degrees of global warming, remember we're headed for 2 to 3 degrees of global warming, 17 to 40 million people would migrate internally in sub-Saharan Africa, increasing to 56 to 86 million people for 2.5 degrees. So where we're currently headed, we could have the population of South Africa displaced from their homes and seeking economic opportunity in other countries. So again, just to emphasize, these are risks you want to avoid. And they're also, slightly uncontrolled. You can't predict the timing of them. You're not sure when they're going to happen, other than that they're linked to this temperature increase. And so if we embrace transition and we embrace new economies that will avoid these impacts, it's also a much more controllable space. It's something we can be much more predictive about. Just to emphasize, no one's saying this is easy. We're talking about an unprecedented global and local effort at a scale we've never seen. But if we don't respond, then the downside impacts are enormous and will exacerbate inequality both globally and locally. So what's happening in the global context? We see some really interesting things. And there's this kind of global war for innovation around science and technology going underway. So you will have heard of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. And so what the United States have done is they've sat down and said, well, what defines security of the future? And security is no longer access to input fuels from an electricity point of view. They are subject to what critical minerals and minerals that we need to build this infrastructure, as well as skills. And so they have put together this incentive package that, amongst other things, addresses the need to manufacture and construct renewable energy locally, with a fantastic response. And what they did was that started to attract investments and away from Europe and into the United States. And so Europe were forced to respond with the Green Deal Industrial Plan, where they stimulated similar kinds of things so that they could try to attract some of this investment back into their economies. So it's a very sophisticated global debate that we are not necessarily applying our minds to here in South Africa, or only really starting to. And I think it's just worth looking at this map, which shows the response to the IRA in terms of renewable energy and clean technology investment across the United States. And what's noticeable is the red states that are really investing. Because it makes good business sense, and so you have the possibility, and relevant for South Africa, to create these kind of bipartisan economic trajectories. The Chip and Science Act is even more interesting. And so Americans again sat down and said, well, what's driving future change? And it's access to technology and computing power and artificial intelligence. And he who controls the sort of chip value chain kind of controls your ability to do that. And realized they were extremely vulnerable to Chinese manufacturing and Taiwanese manufacturing processes. And so started to localize manufacturing of chips. And so the Chip and Science Act is really what drives that. But of course, China are not foolish in this game. And so they then said, well, we're going to ban the critical minerals that you need to make chips. And so again, there's this kind of global trade war, this global innovation war, that are relevant to our economies, but not necessarily something we're applying our mind to. China and India are amongst the biggest investors in these spaces. They're building more renewable energy than anywhere else in the world. They're canceling more coal-fired power plants than anywhere in the world. And I think this statistic is very interesting from E3G, is the stat to watch is not the rate at which coal is being built. The stat to watch is the rate at which coal is being cancelled. So if we look at the July 2015 pipeline of coal projects versus the 2022 pipeline of coal projects, you can see that just sort of 1,000 gigawatts of coal was cancelled because it's not economic, it's not competitive, it's not the cheapest way forward. So these are global trends that we can see easily in the data. So how should South Africa respond? And I want to make the point that the opportunity for a just transition is enormous. And we did a study with Cambridge Econometrics that looks at economic strategy. We created a simple 2x2. What if we transition to 1.5 degrees and the world doesn't? And what if the world transitions to 1.5 degrees and we don't? And so you can see in a world where we transition, and the important thing about the Cambridge model is it's an econometric model that has like over 100 countries and their trade patterns. And so we could really test with this model the impact of trade on economic development. And so if you look at a world where we transition to net zero and the world doesn't, so the world transitions slower, our economic growth would be 7.5%. And this is because you are exporting new things, vanadium, copper, electric cars, but you're also still exporting old things, coal, and so on. In a business as usual world where we do nothing, but the rest of the world transitions to 1.5, you see we have the biggest economic contraction. And that's really because no one is buying our commodities. And our commodities are very carbon intensive and therefore subject to things like trade barriers and trade tariffs like CBAM from the EU. In a world where we transition to net zero and to 1.5 degrees, we have some economic growth. Now, it's tempting to say, well, we should therefore transition to net zero and hope that the rest of the world doesn't. But the column that we miss then in that table is the climate outcome and the sort of temperature increases. So in an over 3 degree world versus an over 1.5 degree world also has economic consequences, as we discussed earlier. And in economic modeling, they call this a damage function. And once you apply the damage function for a world over 3 degrees, you can see that it starts to cancel out the gains from this sort of theoretical world where the rest of the world moves too slowly. And so even without these climate impacts, but especially with these climate impacts, the suggested economic strategy of us transitioning to net zero, regardless of what the rest of the world does, is the logical way forward. And just looking at 3 studies, one done by the National Business Initiative, one done by the World Bank, and one done by TIPS. And these are the kinds of opportunities that we talk about in this transition. We can establish green manufacturing hubs. We can provide global shipping with net zero bunker fuels, and therefore entrench our position as a sort of global trade route. We can export fertilizers, net zero fertilizers. We can export green iron and green steel to the EU. We can produce sustainable aviation fuels. We can act as an export hub for critical minerals mined in Southern Africa. We can localize manufacturing chains. There's an enormous amount of opportunity in this transition. It just requires some clear focus and effort. And the results of those are encouraging. We can create more than 5 million jobs. We can protect 1.2 million jobs. 30% fewer people living in poverty with additional disposable income, and according to the World Bank's Country Climate Development Report. Now, we can avoid 2,300 deaths per year and economic costs of 42 billion per year on air quality. and we can double GDP. Remember earlier I said hold that point in your head where you will sort of have 100% decline in GDP by 2050. We can actually double GDP by 2050 if we choose different pathways. So the opportunity is huge, and in this process, we can look at structural issues around reducing inequality, unemployment, and poverty. So I guess my argument here is that aggressively pursuing change with our eyes wide open to the challenges, we're not pretending it's easy or all of the problems have been solved, is the best way forward. And starting with the electricity sector, but innovating across the whole economy in a manner that addresses structural change is critical. And that structural changes will help unlock reductions in poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So what can the science community do? And a colleague of mine, Jesse Burton, used a really interesting analogy in a conference we held yesterday, in fact, where you have a fork in the road, and we have to make some choices about what direction we're going to take. And we're so paralyzed by the debate and the uncertainty and the misinformation that we're just going to plow into the barrier in the middle of the fork. And so we need a better way to try to build consensus and understand these challenges. And I guess from our perspective, we need to shift our mindset from it's impossible to the science, engineering, technology community is the community from which the solutions will come. And we hear this often, we haven't solved grid stability at a 2-second or even a nanosecond time scale at levels of 80% penetration, and therefore we should do nothing now. No. It's clear that we can get at least up to 50% penetration of renewables now without causing any major problems to the grid. Let's do that, and then let's apply our minds to solving those future problems. So we need, without the involvement of the science community providing really good data and really good studies, what you end up having is a debate around ideology, because there's no kind of fact base from which to draw. So we desperately need you to get involved, read what has been done. There are a lot of really excellent studies. I mentioned the work of the CSIR and CUCT and NBI earlier, but also Bloomberg. And then let's start to understand and fill those gaps. So the key message is supporting the national debate on transitions with solid research. I wanted to leave you with one last just transition slide, really just a stark reminder of the degree of the challenge. And this is work done by the National Business Initiative in their report on agriculture, forestry, and land use. The average household spends about 1,000 Rand a month on food today, which is 2,000 Rand a month lower than what is needed to get a nutritious basket of food. So even when we don't think about climate change and transitions, today's economic structure means that most households are structurally lacking in nutrition, with all of the development impacts that has, stunted growth, inability to learn. And so even without thinking about climate change, we need to be thinking about transitioning our economy in a way that triples household income without creating sort of inflationary wage pressure. And so that in itself is a challenge. To have a climate-friendly, nutritious basket of food, we need to be spending 4,300 Rand a month per household on food. And this kind of just encapsulates the challenge of the transition for me and where we are. So we're failing dismally, but we can do better, and we need to basically quadruple household income as a sort of benchmark of the just transition. So hopefully that's been interesting, and I'm happy to take questions when the opportunity arises. And I'll hand back to you, Janssen.